Vinod's elder brother, who will chair this session. Ashok Mehta is a general from the Gorkha regiment who fought in all wars after 1947. He raised the Defence Planning Staff, currently the Integrated Defence Planning Staff, and commanded the IPKF, Indian Peacekeeping Force, South in Sri Lanka. After retiring, General Mehta has been involved in initiatives related to conflict resolution and UN peacekeeping. He has been a columnist since 1991 and is the author of books and monographs on Nepal, Iraq, Sri Lanka and issues of defense and national security. General Mehta, may I request you to kindly address the gathering and to introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Sumita. Am I audible there? Yes. Good. This is the evening, ladies and gentlemen, of the Mehtas. There are already 3 Mehtas on the stage. And I'm sure amongst this audience, there must be at least 2 or 3 Mehtas. Because Mehta is a very cosmopolitan name, I assure you. You can be a Odia, you can be a Parsi, you can be a Punjabi, and you can also be a Gujarati. It's useful to be a Gujarati these days. And in fact, I recall Vinod telling me about this 105-year-old Gujarati lady. I couldn't believe this story that Vinod told me. And the story goes something like this, that this 105-year-old lady had a passion for drinks. And she said that for better digestion, she was 105 years old by the way, for better digestion, I drink beer. And for appetite loss, I drink white wine. When I have low blood pressure, please note, I drink red wine. And when I have high blood pressure, I drink single malt. And when I have a cold, I drink schnapps. So Vinod said that the interlocutor asked her, when do you drink water? She said, I've never been that ill. My name, as I was introduced by my sister-in-law, is Ashok Mehta. And whenever people would ask me, they would ask me in these parties when Vinod was around, that General, you are Vinod's brother. So I said, certainly not. Vinod is my younger brother. And that was not the only time I disowned him, because Vinod had disowned me too. When he was the editor of Debonair magazine, way back in the 70s, I was a lieutenant colonel in the army. And I can talk about this incident because I don't think I'll be liable to arrest or anything like that. I had written for Vinod a story during the emergency called Coup d'etat, the mechanics of doing it in India. And when this story was published, people from the intelligence department went and knocked on Vinod's door in Empire Estate building near Ambassador Hotel in Bombay and said, asked him, ki ye kisne likha hai ye? Who wrote this story? And he told them that these people who had come to investigate, he said, I don't know. I found an envelope outside my door, and inside the envelope was this story on coup d'etat. Actually, it's inspired by a chap called Edward Luttwak. And it created quite a stir. But mercifully in this country, neither has there been a coup, nor can there ever be a coup, which is very good. Now, because it is the evening of the Mehtas, let me come to the real Mehta. And the real Mehta is Pratap Bhanu Mehta. Now, we all know him as we read him regularly in the Indian Express. We also know him because he's going to talk this evening about death of liberalism. Very topical. People ask me, we don't see you on TV anymore. I said, they don't call me because I can't chant JSR. Because unless you are able to do that and wag your finger and have gutsy lungs and loud voice and you can fight those 10 other guys, it's no good going on TV these days. And your credentials have to be certified even before you begin speaking. That unfortunately is how it is. So they don't call me anymore. So some of you who might ask me after the lecture, why aren't you on TV? Well, I give you the answer in advance. Pratap Bhanu Mehta is a prolific writer, a great speaker, and we could have found a better person for this evening. And I'm sure Vinod will be listening to him from up there, and he would completely endorse our choice of Pratap Bhanu Mehta as the speaker for this evening. Pratap Bhanu Mehta has also been the chairman of the Center for Political Research, Policy Research, Policy, Politics, more or less the same thing. And so we are going to let Pratap Bhanu take over, and you'll take about? What? 45 minutes. Good. And he's agreed to take questions. So, on to the real Mehta of the evening.
Smitaji, General Mehta, I cannot resist, since you talked about kind of Mehtas from different states, so Mehta from Rajasthan. And one of my biggest challenges is that at some point I got onto some Gujarati matrimonial network, and they keep sending me emails, and when you click unsubscribe, it says you have already unsubscribed, and the emails keep coming anyway. So there's no escaping being a Gujarati. It's a great honor and privilege to be here, and frankly a little bit intimidating. Vinod Mehta was a very distinctive voice in our intellectual pantheon, and I think particularly missed at this point because both his independence and his very inimitable way of deflating people's potentials would have been something so politically valuable, I think, at this juncture. And those are the kinds of voices where you could actually say something serious without taking yourself too seriously. I think that distinctive liberal trait, I think, is something we miss terribly. But the second reason, and I'll begin with a confession, I think, which is that I think we are at a kind of political and intellectual juncture where, I don't know about all of you, But sometimes one does get the sense that it's very difficult to say anything new or meaningful when one can make one's positions clear on various issues of the day. But I think the churn of our times is such that I think at some point one has to kind of sit back and say, okay, are we getting what's going on right? To what extent have we become prisoners of our own frameworks and assumptions and positions? And to what extent that is coming in the way of understanding the world? And I think this is the kind of self-examination that VINOD would have actually encouraged. So what I have to offer to you today is not, so to speak, kind of polished lecture or even a worked out argument, but it is following something that was, I think, Nietzsche's advice to people who pretend to think, particularly in times where they feel completely out of joints with the times in which they live in. And he said, look, those times, what do we have to do? We should all become like cows, which is eat a little bit of grass and try and ruminate. So this is a little bit of a rumination on, and I hope it becomes a collective rumination, on a theme that has, I think, been preoccupying a lot of us, but as part of a global conversation, and I will kind of deliberately pitch it at a global level, although I think the issues of relevance to India will become apparent, which is on this whole question of the death of liberalism. As you know, last week President Putin quite grandly announced the death of liberalism in an interview to the Financial Times. Of course, if you ask Mr. Putin, how do you know liberalism is dying, I suspect his answer would be because I'm making sure that it is, both in Russia and abroad. But the trope that he raised, which is, has liberalism as a certain kind of normative horizon which has defined institutional, personal and political thinking across the world, has this outlived its utility? And one of the things I'll try and offer in the next few minutes is illumination of what this might actually mean, right? This is, by the way, not just a trope that is limited to Mr. Putin or Mr. Xi or Mr. Erdogan or various autocrats who would be very happy if liberalism was declared dead and buried. It's a much larger trope, I think, in the politics even of advanced liberal democracies. The sense of intellectual exhaustion about liberalism, the sense of, even if it's not intellectual exhaustion in a strict philosophical sense, a sense of deep political exhaustion. You know, it's like the most boring thing you can be defending is liberalism. Who gets excited by that, right? That sense is actually very widespread, right? And certainly if you look at intellectual output, the death of an ideology is always a great publishing industry. You know, our good friend Edward Luce's The Death of Western Liberalism, Patrick Deneen, The End of Liberalism. I mean, just like a spate of end of liberalism books in very many different contexts, including including our own, right? Now, of course, one can take some solace from the fact that the end of liberalism is pronounced very frequently globally. I was just doing a kind of bibliographical check, and I think from the 1925 onwards, roughly every 5 to 7 years, there's a big cycle of end of liberalism books. Dangerfield's classic in the 1920s, The Strange Death of Liberal England, to 1969, Ted Loy's The End of Liberalism. It's almost like a recurring theme that there is a fundamental infirmity built into liberalism that will make it periodically vulnerable, right? And vulnerable to the point that people will pronounce its death from different angles, from the left, from the right, from the top, from the down. So one of the things I thought we could do in the next few minutes is try and think about what makes these pronouncements of the death of liberalism somewhat distinctive this time around. Or is this one of those meteorological things, right? Where with a little bit of waning of temperature, we suddenly say the world has changed and, you know, hopefully the temperature will go back to an equilibrium in 3 or 4 years and we will worry about these things less. So So this really is, as I said, an attempt to try and think through what do people mean by the end of liberalism, and what might be distinctive about the attack on liberalism at this moment, which makes it perhaps different from the standard repertoire of attacks that liberalism has in a sense always faced throughout its history, right? It's too individualistic, it's too rights-based, it's not egalitarian enough. There's a whole kind of repertoire from the beginning of liberalism. So before I get into that, just sort of two little caveats. One I've already mentioned, as I said, that I think a proper study of the pronouncements of the death of liberalism would require, I think, a longer range historical view than I'm going to give. But the second caveat I want to just kind of put out there, and this is a professional hazard, which is by training and instinct, I tend to think like a political theorist. And when I tend to think of liberalism, I'm not a Hegelian or Marxist who has the conviction that reality has a rationality that will unfold, that there's an inbuilt teleology somehow that the world was in the business of being liberal, right? And somehow the weight of sociological forces will push it in the direction of being liberal. In fact, I think one of the hallmarks of liberal politics is that while it recognizes the influence of sociology, it's not a prisoner of sociological reality. And I think one of the big dangers facing liberalism at this moment is that I think liberals are much more enthralled to a sociological determinism than the opponents of liberalism are, which is what makes them politically so powerful and what gets them to think politically. So in that sense, as a political theorist, one can say there's the easy way out, right? How can liberalism be actually dead is an idea? Who could possibly be against the idea that we are free and equal and that all human beings have a presumptive right to political dignity? Who can be against the idea that the way power is organized in society, both private and public power, should be dispersed so that all forms of absolutism are checked? Who can be against a moral psychology that's central to liberalism, which is that the world is actually at one level a tragic world? And tragic in a very specific liberal sense, which is that we are all bound to disagree, that the starting point of any decent society is one that takes the fact of disagreement seriously. Because one of the things that that imposes upon us is that the world is not in the business of corresponding to our vision of it. And the challenge of human existence is to be able to face up to that fact powerfully. Who could be against the idea, which I think is at the core of liberal moral psychology, contrary to what its critics claim, that human beings are not meant to be encapsulated in formulas, right? That in a sense, the burdens of human existence are such that there will be varieties of pathways of self-realization. And you might say, who could possibly be against this stuff, right? And does this stuff even require, in a sense, philosophical justification or defense? And I'm not going to go into a philosophical, I think, defense of liberalism. What I'll try and go through is, why is it that people think liberalism is exhausted at this point? And what are the kinds of arguments they advance for that exhaustion? So, one of the things that I think characterizes this particular moment, and why I think the challenge liberalism is facing is distinctive from the kinds of challenges it's faced in the past, right? As I said, sometimes liberalism has been accused of not being egalitarian enough, in which case it can triangulate a little bit to the left and incorporate an element of social democracy in it. Those kinds of challenges have always existed. But I think at this point, there's a constellation of exhaustion arguments that are coming from very many different directions simultaneously. And I just want to, I think for clarity's sake, list them out, because I think it will then give us a handle on, okay, in what sense is liberalism really dead and vulnerable? So the first set of arguments that pronounce the death of liberalism is actually a very paradoxical set of arguments, because this is a set of arguments that says liberalism is now going to fail precisely because it succeeded. Okay? Actually, even in Putin's interview, there's a gesture to that argument, that there is something about liberalism getting institutionalized as an hegemonic ideology, that it actually turns into the opposite of what it claims to be, right? The philosophical argument to this effect is, I think, Patrick Deneen's book on the End of Liberalism, where broadly speaking the argument is that liberalism has failed because it's succeeded, right, in becoming a hegemonic ideology. It was all right as an insurgent ideology, as an ideology of resistance. But when it becomes an hegemonic ideology, it fails because everything it touches becomes the opposite of what it promises. So liberal egalitarianism, right, the idea that we should respect all persons equally, right, turns into its opposite of some insipid doctrine that respecting all people equally means respecting all opinions equally, which turns liberalism into the opposite of what is intended. The liberal right to freedom becomes actually something the opposite. It's also the right to falsehood as well, not just the right to truth. And that if you actually test the doctrine out, right, in a culture where you say, yes, I have the right to be anything I want, right to say anything I want, including anything mendacious, false, all of that, it actually becomes a parody of what the liberal right to free expression becomes. Liberal fraternity is hollowed out because there is an excessive individualism at the heart of liberalism, where the central moral claims are either claims around individual rights, or sometimes worse, the primary language of politics is the politics of interest group negotiation, right? Okay? So it becomes a parody. Where is their fraternity, all of this? Liberal institutionalism, its biggest strength, right, which is an institutional imagination based on form, procedure, checks and balances, that has become a parody of itself by producing consistent gridlock and a really anemic politics governed largely by bureaucrats and lawyers who are the only people who care about form, right? Whereas the masses care about results, right? The liberal defense of the market, always a qualified defense of the market, has turned into its opposite, which is the commodification of almost all forms of social existence. The liberal conceit, right, that markets can remain limited to the economy and not colonize other realms of existence, including family and society, right, that hope has been belied. So that every single liberal principle, right, in the extreme version of it, that its critics think have become institutionalized, has turned liberalism into the opposite of what is intended, and has left liberalism in some senses defenseless, right? So that's the first set of arguments. Liberalism has failed because it has succeeded too well, right? And in succeeding too well, it has actually become a parody of itself, right? I don't want to say much about this argument at this moment, except to, I think, acknowledge one little grain of truth in this argument. And I think it comes out particularly when you think of criticisms of contemporary ideas of liberal freedom, right? It's true, liberals will defend freedom, and they will defend freedom particularly on the grounds that the bar that you have to pass to say that something should be subject to state coercion, that's a very special form of moral intervention, and the bar for that should be extremely high. You can go into what that is. But I think in the history of liberalism, right, I think it is true that the defense of freedom and its institutionalization was always premised on a certain degree of social self-restraint. You know, Mark Twain's quip about the freedom of expression, that Americans have the perfect liberty to say anything they want, but the good sense never to say it, right, was not just a funny witticism. I think it did pick out something very central about the liberal imagination in almost all contexts, which is that liberals would have to shape a sense of self, right, where the sense of restraint and judgment would in a sense be internal, right, to what people thought was worth saying and in pursuit of living a good life. It actually breaks down, right, or ideas of freedom expression break down exactly at the moment when you think they are needed most, where you have a societal culture where literally anything goes, right? So can you imagine a society where absolutely everybody is intent on giving offense to everybody else all the time, right? What does the defense of the legal principle of freedom of expression actually mean in that context, right? And so in that sense, the idea that liberalism fails because it succeeds, I think does pick out this idea that precisely because liberalism became juridified as a legal concept, right, it actually in a sense paid less attention to the things that had always characterized it, a sense of judgment, that much maligned virtue, moderation, right, the sense of reconciliation, and a sense, a tragic sense of the world, right, that you're not going to win every argument. So, on this view, liberalism has run its course because it's turned into its opposite. And often critics charge, and one of the, I think, rhetorical charges of this moment, is that liberals are vulnerable precisely because they are seen as betraying exactly, right, the value that they espouse for. How do you criticize false speech, right, in the context of an absolutist defense of freedom, right? Now, of course, a good liberal will make the distinction. There's a distinction between what the state can prohibit, right, and what we should socially sanction. But there you are again, right? It presumes that there is a kind of culture of communication that actually recognizes what those boundaries are that do not come from state power. So this is Putin's first charge. Liberalism fails because it succeeds. The second charge that comes more from the left is liberalism fails because it betrayed itself. And the simple version of this charge comes in one word, which is neoliberalism, right? Which is liberalism's loss of legitimacy and credibility comes from the fact that it actually got transformed into neoliberalism. Neoliberalism on this view is a particular view of organizing the economy that furthers the marketization of relations in almost all spheres of social life, right? But whose net result is rising inequality and the creations of structures of plutocracy and oligarchy that govern us. And the champions of liberal values, because of their sociological identification with this structure of economic power, right, have actually become delegitimized. This is a kind of version of the argument that, you know, people used to make in the French Revolution against the Catholic Church. The problem was not so much that people were against religion, but because Catholic Church was so aligned with the ruling monarchy, in the revolution both had to go down, right? And this is fundamentally, on this view, the challenge for modern liberalism. That because of its sociological and cultural identification with neoliberalism, right, the very elites who should have been in the vanguard of defending liberal cultural values also got tainted with, right, the charge of corruption, oligarchy and plutocracy, right? The revolt against oligarchy and plutocracy would also in a sense take the liberal order down, just like it took the church down, right? So this is in a sense the charge from the left, and on this view, the central weakness of liberalism, right, which is that liberalism trying to uneasily operate in this wedge between democracy and capitalism has roughly failed to get the balance right? And in doing so, it has betrayed its own promise, right, of in a sense insulating political power, insulating social and cultural power from pure economic power. So this is the opposite charge. Notice Putin doesn't make this charge, right? And I'm sure for very good reason. Okay? The third set of arguments is liberalism does not fail because it succeeds, liberalism does not fail because it creates itself, but fundamentally liberalism fails because liberalism has always rested on a fundamental illiberal ground, right? And there is a ground beneath liberalism which it always rests on, which is fundamentally illiberal, but it's a ground it can never own up to, right? And there is something about this political moment, right, where that ground has become particularly exposed. So what is this illiberal ground on which liberalism has always stood? There are two particular strands to this illiberal ground. One comes across in this question of, okay, liberalism is a great theory of justice. Liberalism has a great theory of rights, institution, moral psychology, all the wonderful things. there's one thing liberalism doesn't have, which is a very good theory of membership of a political community. Right? Given that we all live in political communities with distinct identities, right, and distinct political claims to sovereignty, the central question is who gets to be a member of that political community. Right? And liberalism's Achilles heel, by the way, it's not just liberalism. Ernest Gellner once made this famous remark that the tragedy of the 20th century is that, you know, a postcard that was meant for particular universalistic ideologies, Marxism, liberalism, they all ended up at the address called nationalism, right? Yeah. But this particular question, who gets to be the member of a political community and what are the terms of that membership, right, is not something liberalism can answer from, in a sense, within its own resources. Right? The second illiberal ground, right, has to do, in a sense, with the prominence of state and executive power in liberal theory. Right? So, as you recall, again, it's something that's endemic to liberalism, which is, on the one hand, liberalism requires the doctrine of checks and balances, right? It requires limited government to protect individual rights, right? But almost every theory of the state, right, leaves open this proviso that if the state is in existential or mortal danger, then the executive power has a certain kind of prerogative, right, which trumps standard liberal restraints. And on this view, right, the big challenge to liberalism is that we are in a constellation of geopolitical circumstances where both of these questions that liberalism constantly fudges around, right? We just hope we don't have to use state power because we are not in mortal danger. You just hope that the question of membership doesn't arise because there's nobody claiming membership to your society who's excluded for it. There's a constellation of geopolitical circumstances that have actually made these two questions very central to our politics again. Right? Immigration, one obvious example. Again, something that's been central to the politics of the United States in very many ways. But there isn't a single country, right? I mean, you just witness the debate over the NRC in our world, right? It's fundamentally, right, a question over membership. And the challenge with any discussion over membership is that this, as I said, is a fundamentally what philosophers called an aporetic question. There is no straightforwardly principled right position here, in the sense that the moral dilemmas, right, that reconciling the distinct existence of a political community with open membership reserves. It's a version of the kind of exchange rate dilemma that economists talk about, right? There's no straightforward answer to that. I mean, often these answers are, in a sense, very practical answers. And what liberals hope is that they are humane answers. They're not answers that actually involve putting people in camps, separating parents from children, extraditing people who've been living for 30, 40 years in a particular country, right? But you can see these are not first principle answers. And I think the charge against liberalism is that in order to maintain a distinct political community, it has always relied on these forms of deterrence. It just never owns up to them, right? And so, secretly, a lot of people are actually quite happy that somebody else is doing the dirty job of liberalism for it, right? By keeping all these people out, right? By, licensing state power in ways that liberals would not own up to. I think, as Pierre Rosavella has argued, I think the rise of executive power is one of the great phenomenons of modern governance. But it is interesting the extent to which carriers of liberalism have been exempt from scrutiny in the way in which they exercise their sovereign power. I think there is a truth in Trump's claim, right, that the exercise of executive prerogative under Obama, right, from an institutional point of view, was probably as serious as anything that you can actually imagine. So on this view, liberalism's failure is it always rests on strong state, which requires state executive prerogative, and some degree to be able to regulate and control membership, right? Except that no liberal wants to be seen to be above these projects. So once in a while you will go through this cycle where liberalism gets somebody else to do your dirty work for them, right? So even on this view, secretly many liberals are also quite pleased, right? That they don't have to take the moral burden of doing this stuff. So this is liberalism fails because of its edges. The fourth set of arguments, right, takes a slightly different cast, which is a more interesting one, slightly unusual one, which is that one of the reasons liberalism is failing is because liberalism's identity and where the balance of values falls within liberalism and how important executive power and state power becomes, for example, has in part been a function of what its rivals have to offer, right? So the case of liberalism and socialism, or liberalism and Marxism, is kind of clearer, which is one of the ways in which liberalism kind of preempts revolution, right, is by turning a little bit more social democratic, right? I mean, to be a little bit cynical about it, almost all liberal constitutionalism is really premised on the project of kind of trying to avoid revolution on the one hand and totalitarianism on the other, right? Okay. So in a sense, it's always had a kind of proteanness where it domesticates its challengers, right, within its framework. And sometimes there used to be this frustration with liberals that liberals are always, oh, but we can accommodate that, right? As this kind of somehow everything can come to be contained within this universe. Now, on this view, we are in a slightly different world. And we are in a slightly different world because the main challenger to liberalism, right, in geopolitical terms, if you think of, what normative ideologies become horizons of reference points in thinking, actually has a very, very different cast. And to give it a very simple name, I think China is, in a sense, the biggest geopolitical competitor to liberalism, perhaps more than Russia as well, for a variety of reasons we can actually go into. But why is it that the China challenge in particular, right, poses or puts a certain kind of pressure in the liberal state in a way that's actually different from pressures liberalism has faced in the past? Now, before I come to that, just one more other geopolitical reference to spell out this argument. So in this view, the geopolitical burden of liberalism is a combination of two things. It's a combination of China and it's a combination of 9/11. Okay? And 9/11 as a kind of metaphor for global thinking about the challenges liberalism faces. So what do both of these things have in common, right? 9/11, right, whatever its proximate causes and so forth, right, as a global cultural phenomenon, not just in the United States, which I think actually domestically handled it well, right, in a sense institutionalized the idea that the threat and subversion to established democratic orders, they call it fundamentalist terror, can actually come in the most hidden, unexpected and insidious forms. What's important about this claim is not the truth of this claim. It's not what threat really did terrorism actually pose to establish liberal orders, right? It is the idea that, right, we are actually faced with a geopolitical threat that is much more subterranean, right? That in a sense operates through the interstices of liberal societies in some ways, takes advantage of it, right? Whether it's through immigration, whether it's through social policies, all kinds of things, right? And the canonization of that kind of threat, right? I mean, just witness the latest G20, right? That's still like the number one threat up there, right? Higher than climate change, go figure, okay? Right? But the canonization of that form of threat, right, as in a sense the default common sense of a liberal society, right, which then licensed this extraordinary increase in surveillance powers, in the suspension of human rights. Think of Guantanamo, for example, and the conditions under which something like that could be legitimized, right? It makes fear, I'm using 9/11 as a metaphor, fear, that kind of political fear, a permanent condition of liberal societies, right? You add to that the China factor, because if you think about the Chinese state, right, one of the most remarkable things about it is, what are the strengths being attributed to the Chinese state? A sense of purpose and direction, right? A state unconstrained by the pieties of liberal proceduralism, gridlock, all those kinds of things that liberals like, right? And therefore capable of more decisive global action, right? A state that is, in a sense, arguably mobilizing its power and legitimacy through extraordinarily unprecedented forms of surveillance, right? And China is going to be the laboratory to kind of watch on this, right? So this idea that a modern successful state, right, will require both a disregarding of proceduralism, but almost also a certain kind of panopticism, right? Where, look, these threats are so insidious, we need to know everything about citizens. We need to track them, right? Okay? So when you're responding to a threat from the left, right, you can appropriate by saying, okay, we'll redistribute it more. You de-radicalize it, right? But if your society ends up with the conviction that one of the sources of state and social power is going to be a certain kind of panopticism, where everything actually becomes transparent to the state, and in doing so it can mobilize its citizens more effectively, right? Okay. Think of what happens to the liberal project. There are even more mundane varieties of this panopticism. I think in India it's largely driven by these accountability concerns. Frankly, I think it's just a nightmare that we're going to put cameras in classrooms. Those who railed against Aadhaar should equally object to this stuff. But the symptomatic thing about that, right, is that panopticism, the idea of rendering citizens completely transparent to the state, is got to be the mode of governance and the mode of creating state power in the 20th century. Right? This is a fundamentally illiberal idea, but this has become our default common sense, right? Right? And it's kind of pushing us to, I think, put up with things which I think most classical liberals would have actually worried about. I think liberalism is very wary of, I think Rousseau said it actually very nicely, although he was on the other side. Transparency is a very totalitarian idea, particularly a project that wants to make citizens completely transparent. Right? So you have a particular geopolitical moment, right, which makes this kind of imagination almost the default common sense of citizens. And, so privacy, surveillance, all of this stuff, and again, how many liberals are willing to sort of, in a sense, disavow that project. As my former colleague at CPR, Partha Mukherjee once prettily put it, said there's one very simple way of thinking about democracy and authoritarianism. When citizens trust each other and distrust their rulers, you get democracy. When citizens distrust each other and trust their rulers, you get authoritarianism. Right? So we've kind of, the practices of governance have in a sense kind of completely flipped. Right? And that's the kind of cumulative space. In a sense, you can see the pincer movement of liberalism from all sides. And I think what makes this moment distinctive, right, and I think a big challenge for liberal politics, is that it has to battle all of these fronts simultaneously, not just as ideas, they're always around as ideas, but in a sense as live political forces. Right? Now, what's been the response to this? And I'll try and sort of wrap up quickly. The popular response, or the kind of institutional political response in most countries, from Hungary to India to Turkey, and there are lots of variations. Each country has its own distinctive history. But the proper force that has kind of counterposed itself to liberalism has been a certain kind of what we call populism. And populism, by its very nature, has a certain kind of policy-making quality to it. It can have elements of left, it can have elements of the right. But the central characteristic of populism, which is it stitches together a set of diverse interests under a single sign, right? But which interests it will stitch together, right? Populism has actually a lot of leeway on, right? I think you're finding this in populist economic policies, right? It can protect a serious oligarchy and yet claim to turn left at the same time, right? Okay. Populism needs anti-intellectualism for one, actually, I think very important cultural reason. I think which is what populism has actually grasped, I think very subtly in a very interesting way, is it was easy for liberals, egalitarian liberals, to rail against inequalities of wealth, right? Okay. We all think poverty is a structural travesty, too much inequality distorts power structures in society. But psychologically speaking, right, poverty is a structural condition with horrendous consequences. And inequality can be a structural condition with horrendous consequences, right? But psychologically speaking, right, populism's main claim is that people find the distinction between social cultural elites and the rest much more offensive than the economic distinction between the rich and poor, right? And this insight, I mean, there was a conversation I once had with somebody in Sonipat, which was revealing. I mean, it's a kind of one of those flippant anecdotes, but had a point. This person asked me, he said, अगर आप किसी को जाके कहें, giving the Hindi version in English, कि आप गंवार हैं, या आप किसी को जाके कहें कि आप गरीब हैं, what do you think they'll be more offended by? Okay? We're not talking about the objective consequences, right? And in a way, populism's, I think, great strength in that sense is not just its ability to create lots of shifting coalitions by working on all of these fronts together, right? And its great strength has been to kind of outflank its opponents. But it has been to, in a sense, sort of say that liberalism rests on a series of cultural distinctions, right? Cultural distinctions that may be centered around achievement, that may be centered around intellect, that may be centered around access to cultural means of production. And it is these distinctions that are actually, from an inequality point of view, much more offensive than merely the distinctions of class, right? So it's not an accident that populist politics, in a sense, requires, right, the targeting of what it thinks of or constantly has to invent as a socio-cultural elite, as the real enemy of the people, right? And has invented a language to actually make that very, very powerfully resonant. And frankly, I think liberals are struggling with this, right? Because they're caught between saying, on the one hand, we are the vanguard of some moral value. Well, vanguard itself is a distance, right? End of story. So you have a political opponent that, as I said, whose advantage is that they are thinking politically constantly, right? And politically in this polysemic way, which is, okay, what's the move we need to outflank? If we need to turn left, we'll turn left. I mean, you know, we can raise taxes on the rich. That's also fine, right? If I have to send a signal that I'm both for free markets, but that somebody is in charge of the economy, there's no constraint in that doing it. And in doing so, they've been able to craft very complicated coalitions, right? Coalitions of oligarchy and genuine popular support behind them, right? Coalitions of the rich and, in a sense, the rich and poor. So where does liberalism go after all of this, right? Is liberalism truly again? As I said, look, the easy cop-out answer is that the philosophical ideas are powerful, defensible, and so forth. But because it's beleaguered in all of these contexts, articulating a form of political resistance to populism on behalf of liberalism actually becomes harder. It becomes harder because if you take all of these 5 arguments, the opponents of populism in a sense don't align on all 5, right? There are people who have signed up on the populist project of a surveillance state and great executive power, right? Okay. But it's quite consistent signing up for that and yet speaking the language of economic egalitarianism. Conversely, it's true that you can actually speak the language of economic egalitarianism, be on the side of neoliberalism and market forces, right? And yet express great shock and horror at the rise of a kind of panopticon state, right? So, what Sun Tzu said about the art of war, that, which apparently, in theory, the Chinese state practices, which is, you first need to gather in all the instruments that you can use, and then use them selectively when they are required, right? So, populists can also speak the language of institutionalism as necessary, at the same moment as they are gutting some other institutions, right? So I think the challenge for liberalism, is that it is, facing a kind of politics that it's actually not used to as an opponent. Totalitarianism was an easy opponent, conceptually, right? You could line up against it, and that's the shape of most Cold War liberalism. I think Marx, communism in some senses, was in a sense an easy opponent, right? Populism, precisely because of its policy inequality, right? Something that people thought liberalism possessed, is turning out to be a much larger challenge. How will it turn out? I am not going to make any predictions. Obviously, a lot depends there on the particular histories of individual countries. I think histories which have more decentered institutions and power, the United States, for example, there are a lot more avenues of power where you can organize that resistance. Congressional races, the structure of political parties are still intact. India, is going to have a much, much harder time for a variety of reasons, partly because all alternative political structures, including political parties, have been, in a sense, decimated. But also because the welding together of all of these 5 elements that I talked about, right, is actually, and this is the big strength that populists have, is not just a political posture, political movement, it is actually a social movement, right? It has begun in the place where liberals used to begin, at the place of education, at the place of family, at the place of civil society, right? And liberalism, in a sense, by becoming a political doctrine and political dogma, right, forgot how you actually begin to engage with society. What is the site for the transmission and reproduction of liberal values, right? This is the first question any 19th century liberal would have asked, right? Okay? It's the last question a contemporary liberal asks, precisely because, right, in a sense, when you succeeded, right, we began to misunderstand the conditions of our own success. So I'm afraid I don't have any prescriptions to offer. As I said, like a cow, this was I think it's time to eat some grass and ruminate, right? But the one thing I think we can take away, and I think this is something Vinod would have said, right, is that we do need to have clarity over our own sense of our convictions about ourselves. And that clarity is strengthened, not weakened, if we actually realize the gap between the grim sociological reality we are facing, right, and the high moral aspirations that liberalism always had. Liberalism has not ended, but it does have to take a much, much longer leap than it ever has had in the recent past.
Ladies and gentlemen, you will agree that this has been a fascinating talk, a lot of food for thought. This says, ruminate, chew the cud. But before we do that, we have time for Q&A. And if anybody would like to ask a question or make a comment, please do so. Yeah, there's a hand up there. Please introduce yourself. There's no. Yeah, just speak loudly.
I'm going to go back to those 5 points. I am Sri Shukla, I work with a friend. You listed 5 sets of arguments to 5 key critiques against liberalism. And you end with the idea that what the populists have is flexibility as opposed to stick to a certain kind of ideological framework. But as you said, it is the vein of reality, through those critiques, perhaps relooking them or revisiting those critiques allows liberalism some amount of flexibility and in a way opens up how you deal with populism. What's your take?
Thanks for a very good question, and I was kind of rushed towards the end. So, yeah. So the question was that that I listed out the 5 critiques of liberalism, and I warned towards the end that one of populism's great strength is its flexibility. And the question is, in a sense, if I understand it correctly, is that if we actually go and revisit those 5 critiques and begin to acknowledge the grain of truth in them, can that actually give liberalism more flexibility, right? So, I think I'd put the question slightly differently, which is, it's not clear what it means to have flexibility, or at least certain basic core values, right? I mean, what does it mean to compromise with a racist, or what does it mean to, right? I mean, that I think is in a sense kind of, that's not the sense of flexibility here, right? I think the sense of flexibility here is in a sense saying that it's changing the question in different ways. Because I think common to all of those critiques, right, is not so much a philosophical critique of liberalism, and that either you can convince somebody or you can't, and you keep going, right? But it is the idea that the bearers of liberalism have lost credibility and are no longer exemplars, right? Which is why the hypocrisy chart sticks, right? Which is why the extremism chart sticks, right? And it's not so much that revisiting those critiques, it'll certainly produce that credit, but I think what it does point to, right, and I think draws attention to, is the fact that the big political task is in a sense not sort of rehearsing liberalism over and over again, right? It's not sort of getting into a kind of dogfight at every instance. It is actually asking what are those precarious conditions under which the bearers of these ideas actually carry some kind of credibility, right? Now, the challenge in a sense, populism in a sense, is that and one thing I did not talk about, whether there's something about this movement, about the structure of public discourse, the organization of media, social media, that actually makes it very difficult to, in a sense, re-establish that credibility. Right? That we are, in a sense, in that moment, because, as I said, this is an asymmetric battle, right? You have to win the battle of truth, they have to win the battle of doubt, right? Right? Because all they have to convince you of is you might think slightly dimly of somebody else, right? Right? Debasing is easier, right? And in a sense, one of the things I think the structure of social media does, right, is precisely because it, on the one hand, gives this illusion of complete transparency. You know what everybody's thinking at any moment. And it erodes the distinction between public and private, which I think was a distinction that was a very important distinction for moral education. Because what that distinction in a sense said that you have a second chance. What it said that your investment in a public position is not necessarily your public identity, right? Which is actually the space in which learning and liberal conversation can actually take place. Once you've taken a public position, apologizing is almost kind of out of the bounds, right? So, what has happened in a sense to public discourse, in a sense, and liberalism, so the challenge is it requires passion behind it, right? But it requires a passion that does not get drawn into the dogfight on the terms that the others are establishing, because then you are committed to repeating their falsehoods in a way that actually gains in a sense more currency. So the question of credibility, I think, is much more important than this kind of yes, no, liberalism will not end, how can we give up on human rights and so forth.
Right here in the front. Oh, why don't you come here so that, please come up here.
Thank you very much, the Chair, and also the Speaker for a very enlightening and profoundly thought-provoking presentation in memory of Mr. VINOD MEHTA. As I understand it, the drivers of liberalism have always been a small minority, and they are largely drawn from the middle class, which again today is shrinking. But for the vast majority, the populist rhetoric seems to be very appealing, and they seem to be falling for this bait, because for them it's a question of survival. So how will liberalism, again based on the moral ground, assert itself? Is there in this world today an example of a country where this kind of liberalism, with its concept of justice, with its concept of egalitarianism, does it exist? Is there an example? Because you talked in terms of the geopolitical reality and not specifically one country. So can we find even a semblance of a model for the world today? So these are my just ruminations as you would want. Thank you.
So maybe I'll begin by registering a slight disagreement with the premise of the question, which is, I mean, and I think it's one of the characteristics of liberalism that by its very nature it finds it hard to become a social movement. A lot of interstitial spaces. But the disagreement with the premise of the question is somehow this notion that there's a kind of middle class vanguard that is liberal that has ceased to be liberal, and the masses of people actually were not liberal. And I think that's also kind of construction of the model in India. Nehru up there, and the masses were not. I actually find that both empirically and historically, I think the reality is a lot more complicated. I think what is true of liberalism in some ways, which is that precisely because it doesn't rely on kind of conventional forms of political mobilization and social movements, it finds it hard, because precisely because it's very broad. A lot of its effectiveness actually turns on the half credibility. Nobody is perfect, everybody has their hypocrisies, but at least a semblance of the credibility of actually those who are influential as in positions of power, right? What is striking about this moment is the most powerful betrayals of liberalism actually come exactly from the classes that you think are the vanguard, right? I mean, in a sense, on all the 5 dimensions we in a sense actually listed, right? Of course, whenever you're talking about any large groups of people, there will be variation and so forth. And again, I think it's important not to fall into that sociological overdeterminism, right? But I think, there's a remark Myron Wiener once made in the 1970s, which is if you look at most societies, it's elites that destroy their institutions, not the masses. Mostly that is still true, I think, right? So in that sense, I mean, that's I think my slight kind of disagreement with you, which is not to say that it's its opponents are not genuinely popular. I mean, I think, I think the question that we wrestle all the time in political science don't have a real answer to offer them, which is actually what makes for credibility in the kind of political area. Because politics is about kind of competitive credibility in some senses, right? It's not simply about the ideas you have or the positions you in a sense espouse. And what is the cultural dynamics, social dynamics, the semiotics, the propaganda power, all those things that go into the construction of that credibility. But I do think it is the case that the bigger betrayal of that liberalism, if you want to call it, or in the sense of the word, is actually come at least as much from the privileged. It's not so much that there's this kind of mass resurgence against it.
There was a hand up, right? Why? Oh, you won't be able to come up.
You can speak. I can repeat your question if you speak. Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, so the textbook answer is that it has a very important role, and it's one of the checks and balances and separation of power which the liberal institutional imagination requires. But it is also the textbook answer of exactly the thing which we are talking about, which is exactly that group of people who were most in the position to defend liberal values on consistent first principle grounds have been its biggest betrayers across the world. And I think it's interesting. I think we are at this point where both in American constitutional law and Indian constitutional law, we basically say just hang up all the textbooks we've ever read. None of the narratives we have, right? The idea that the kind of the Warren Court is the default of what judicial review means. But the core thing, and I think this is where the judiciary succumbed to it. I mean, apart from its own internal credibility, its identification with internal corruption and so forth. But fundamentally, when the judiciary itself became, very early on, the exemplar of an impatience with forms and institutions. And many of us, in fact, there's this wonderful warning by P.K. Tripathi as early as 1969, right, about Gajendra Gadkar saying, look, this is all absolutely excellent, social stuff and all of that. But the day the judiciary itself instrumentalizes law, right, and I think the PIL revolution, which I thought at the time was also a disaster, to be honest. I think it was the first inklings of how populism can actually destroy an institution without
was a fatal project.
So, look, we can debate. I actually think Oakeshott is a liberal, but that's all. I mean, this. But whose fundamental instincts in almost every sense are actually deeply, deeply liberal. And it's exactly all of these things, right? Which is some degree of epistemic humility, which is the kind of the cornerstone, right? I mean, I'm not sure where Oakeshott actually got the idea that liberal. I can't think of a liberal who actually was not epistemically humble in at least philosophical doctrine. The importance of forms, right? The idea that the state as an association is actually defined by the form, not simply the instruments to which it is used, right? That very enigmatic but splendid last chapter of On Human Conduct, right? Extremely liberal. Modes of experience, I think Oakeshott's greatest book, right? Which is the human existence is in a sense marked by deeply incommensurable modes of experience. So I actually think, I mean, in fact, that's that. And finally, I mean, the most important point I think in the current context, which does resonate, which is asking that fundamental question of outside of a defense of legal forms, which liberals are very good at. What rights do we have? Where does state power not fall, right? What kind of a liberal subject do you need to constitute, right? Which has, in a sense, these characteristics and can exercise, most importantly, a sense of judgment, right? And that's that old kind of John Taylor is don't reduce everything to a formula. So I think it's worth rereading.
Going back to the issue of flexibility of populism, in India, at the heart of the populist enterprise, we have the RSS, which is very dogmatic and uncompromising on certain social and cultural issues. So how far do you think the presence of an organization like the RSS within the populist enterprise limits the success of this populism in India? Or is it that the creation of the other is so powerful that it will overcome the disadvantages of the inflexibility?
That's a very important question. So, I mean, obviously one thing it clearly, straightforwardly poses, right, which is that the RSS actually gives this populism the character of a social movement, right, which is a trajectory and an aspiration that goes simply beyond electoral politics, right? And in that sense, you know, the battle for kind of reclaiming civil society, right, cannot be fought only through political means, right? Because in a sense, the foundations on which that politics is built, right, is an enormous cultural labor, right, of institutionalizing and infiltrating this ideology across kind of different institutions, right? And in that sense, I mean, that's just if you're looking kind of instrument for instrument, right? That's now a kind of permanent thing in that arsenal, which you actually have to reckon with, even if the BJP had lost or not done as well. The fact is, this arsenal exists in a deeply institutionalized form, and one thing we haven't actually, in a sense, unpacked, in a sense, what makes it successful in the way that it does, purely as an organizational form, right? I mean, that's a right. But I think, I mean, I think in a sense more than that. I mean, there's a couple of ways of sort of thinking about this counterfactualism, which is, you know, one is of course this kind of nice reopening of the debate over the 1950s and 1960s and the nature and character of the Congress Party in the 1950s and 60s, which is, had it not been for the assassination of Gandhi, would the left-right political configuration in India, even as early as the 1950s, be very, very different, right? in some ways. I mean, you know, you now read archives of the Congress Party in the 1950s from UP, for example, Govind Ballabh Pant. I mean, he could easily belong to the RSS, to be honest, right? This deep disjuncture between a kind of a cultural secularism and an electoral secularism, right, would have probably played out very differently, right? In that context, and I think this kind of this confusion of that electoral secularism with, you know, what you might say the deep kind of cultural roots, and again, very much an elite phenomenon in some senses in parts of the Congress Party. But the one thing I will say, and this is not in, I think, for those of us who don't want the RSS to grow, is, I think, not underestimating its own flexibility in certain ways, right? I mean, you know, we can argue against RSS appropriating Ambedkar, this, that, and the other, right? But the remarkable fact is that just as a sociological phenomenon, it has changed its character very dramatically. Just as the BJP has in social terms, right? I mean, that whole story, the BJP is an upper caste party, all of that. Yeah, I mean, if you bean count office bearers, yes, right? But I think it's profoundly underestimated, right? Its ability to, in a sense, create new identity formations. What it has done with nationalism, of course it requires another, right? But I think what gives and why I was kind of, it's worth connecting it to the global discourse, is that because those illiberal disavowals of liberalism, right, have now become the open global norm, right, which is on the issue of immigration and membership and on the issue of executive and state power, right, it actually gives the RSS a much wider leeway to work in, and that's the language that's used more. Right? I mean, this is nationalism, this is membership, and who could possibly, I mean, how could you possibly be against legals versus illegals, right? Right? So, in that sense, it's actually, although its consequences are similar, right, it's actually far more supple in its thinking about discourses in which it could insert itself, right, which on the face of it seem, let's say, a lot more palatable, right, than a simple othering.
We'll take two more questions. One, the lady here.
Thank you very much. That was almost something that was a self-reflecting exercise because it was much needed.
You want to come up here?
As liberals, we've been wanting this self-reflective exercise for quite a while, so thank you for the clarity that your speech offered. The one thing, and the thing that really hit me is what you said about how do the liberals engage with society, because it feels still after all this while still quite ephemeral. But one thing I wanted to talk about is, and I didn't hear, is the other thing that liberals don't understand, and I think liberals and people across the political spectrum don't understand, is the true nature and insidiousness of narcissism as a personality disorder, but also how leaders and their personality traits create an imprint on society and make it the very nature and the DNA of society. So, for example, if liberals did understand it's not just the rise of the right, but actually the rise of narcissists in most of these societies, and it is a phenomenon that is virtually an epidemic now. And if liberals truly understood what narcissism is, maybe they would be better equipped.
Now we are heading into kind of important, complicated psychoanalytic territory. Yeah. So, I think two or three things, and one is a counter question which I'll just spark, and I'm actually sympathetic to a lot of what you're saying, right? And that is that when you think of these strongmen phenomena, right, as embodiment of the people in its full narcissism, right? How much much of it is the person driving the politics and how much of it is the personal reflection of the politics, right? So is Modism or Trumpism a political phenomenon that happens to find its manifestation in this particular figure, but it could have been anybody else? Or is it that particular figure, right, something inherent about them that then actually brings up DNA in this? And part of what I was going to say in this kind of larger story is that I think we are underestimating the degree to which it's also the former, that in a sense the figure is in a sense the kind of stand-in, right? Napoleon can become France because France has become Napoleon, right? I mean, that's right. And in that sense, I think I think the two sort of, in a sense, I think feed on. I think each other. But I think the narcissism thing, I mean, one has to be careful because it is a very technical category in some ways, right? But I think, let me put it slightly differently and maybe link it to a point which I did mention briefly, which is, so presumably this fate is distributed in society in normal times across populations in different ways, right? But is there something about the structure of public and social presentation at this point, right, that rather than containing it actually in a sense magnifies it, right? Which is the obverse of transparency, right? A certain kind of psychological condition where the worst thing that can happen to you is invisibility, right? There were traditional forms of invisibility, right? Obviously the poor are invisible, the marginalized are invisible. But in a sense, those were forms of invisibility that were partly compensated by, in a sense, kind of ghettoizing communities, right? We just don't hang out with people because we don't want to suffer those humiliations. So it's ghettoization, but it actually still allows a certain kind of creation of community that's in its different way, right? That's how we actually cope with social distance, right? That's just not a place for us, right? I think, in a sense, what the flattening of that social media and presentation space does, right, is that it both simultaneously increases the premium on visibility, right, and it actually breaks down all of these different spaces that could at least operate under the fiction of being different spaces, right? And so, in a sense, there's nothing kind of containing, in a sense, containing that, I think, in a sense anyway, which is, it is now self-presentation kind of all the way down. It's almost like a double invisibility, right? Not only we kind of socially marginal because we are in a sense kind of disempowered, right? But this very thing that you think costs nothing to exhibit ourselves is also disempowering us. So I think we're just at the beginning of trying to kind of understand, is there, and the liberal public sphere, you could argue was always hierarchical and mediated, right? And had its own exclusions, right? But in a sense, like with representative democracy, right? What it did say is that if you want to actually explore yourself truly, right, the best spaces in which it is done are not necessarily public. There's something absurd about doing it in public, right? And that's the distinction that's kind of broken down, right? So in that sense, narcissism has become a kind of generalized condition of in a sense, all of us, we need to make ourselves visible at each point.
Last question, that gentleman there. Will you please come up here? You, yeah, that's you. Yeah.
I am Manojma, a journalist from Reuters News. Thank you, Mr. Mehta, for a very thought-provoking question and answer session as well as your speech. We have been reading your column for almost last 1 decade. So we feel after 2 hours today, there is a sense of doom and gloom. That things are in very bad shape. Perhaps with the victory of Prime Minister Modi and the rise of right-wing politics from Turkey, from China, from Russia. So we are feeling like a sense of defeat. So all of us who are like claim to be liberals, what message would you like to give? Particularly? Thank you.
I think the whole point is we should stop giving messages. I think more seriously. I don't think. Look, I think doom and gloom is, you know. Let's put it this way: the political challenge, I think, has been magnified in ways that I think we've not been accustomed to for a couple of generations. And the question is whether we can turn it into an opportunity of some kind. But I don't think we should be under the illusion that this is about one election cycle or something. I think this is now a longer and complicated social process. In a way, the luxury of being at least marginal for a few months till hopefully somebody will score a self-goal is that it allows us to get some distance, right, from, I think, the syndrome which we got into, which is let's get into a wrestling match like at every single point, right? And which is actually paradoxically turning out to strengthen the very thing which we wanted to combat.
I just wanted to ask a question. Recently we've seen this great country, our neighbor, entire community stood up against an illiberal act which was passed against the entire community, China mainland, and they have stopped. Madam Wei has stopped that act for the moment. It hasn't been passed. So the entire city rose up against it. Is it possible to stand against an illiberal action of a government?
You're talking about the protests in Hong
Hong
Kong.
Kong, the protests in Hong Kong. No, it's certainly not only possible, but in a sense, I think emboldening the resistance requires a couple of those pivotal moments, because what it does is it actually gives people the courage to say that there are other people thinking like you just haven't seen them. But I think it's early days, like with all popular protest movements, to I think see that as a moment of victory. I mean, I'll be a little bit cynical, but here's my political science hat on this, which is, I think the only circumstance in which this will translate into an enduring victory for Hong Kong is if there is elite division within mainland China. Otherwise, these states are just so powerful, right, that they'll actually sit on this and wipe the blood off the floor. I think that old story that, social revolutions require a certain kind of fissure and division within the state, right? Certain elites outflanking each other. I think we'll have to I think it's too premature to see whether that moment will happen in China and in other contexts, like India's, to see where that fissure might be. Because people power does require also that political opening at the top for it to translate into something institutional and enduring.
Pratap, Bhanu Mehta, we couldn't have found a better speaker for VINOD Mehta's first memorial lecture. It's been a fascinating On behalf of VINOD Mehta and all friends of VINOD Mehta and all of you here, may I thank Mr. Mehta, the real Mehta here, for this wonderful exposition. And we must remind you that later in the year, in September, the Outlook magazine dedicates an evening to Vinod Mehta. And therefore we look forward to seeing you there also. In the end, once again, many, many thanks for this wonderful exposition. Thank you.
Members of the press, and most importantly, all of you here, your presence has made this occasion what it is. Thank you very, very much.